Good evening, everyone. It's 7 o'clock, and I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. What a great turnout. We're very excited for our guest speaker, and we're absolutely sure you're going to find this presentation from Jeff Speck compelling, thought-provoking, and insightful. Recently, the City of Cedar Rapids updated its comprehensive plan. This is a plan that the core of development of that plan is based on intensive and extensive opportunities for public feedback. And one of the messages that came back to the city through that feedback process in a resounding response, people told us again and again that they wanted to see Cedar Rapids continue to grow into a connected, walkable, vibrant community with pockets of pedestrian activity and areas where we can bike, hang out with friends, shop, eat, and enjoy the atmosphere of our community. Jeff Speck is a nationally recognized city planner and urban designer. He's the author of The Walkable City, How Downtown Can Save America One Step at a Time. Jeff advocates for smart growth and sustainable design, casting a vision for cities that are mobile, vibrant, and accessible. About 3 years ago, the Public Works Department engaged Jeff with his expertise and guidance to help us implement better designs for complete street standards, where complete streets actually provide for not only vehicular traffic, but for bicycle traffic, for pedestrian traffic, for ADA type accommodations, for the aesthetic enhancements, the street lighting to improve safety, and the other amenities that go with the neighborhoods that are desired by the neighborhoods. We continue to use him as a subject matter expert when we have questions on how to really improve a neighborhood and make things fit in the neighborhood that when the neighborhood was originally designed didn't anticipate all of those types of modes of mobility operations and challenges that we have when we try to commingle those with some of these older neighborhoods. So tonight's presentation will help paint a picture of this trend to make the neighborhoods more friendly to those different mobility uses, why more cities are integrating these design changes throughout the country, and it'll provide a catalyst for more pedestrian activity and economic development. So I'm pleased to introduce you to Jeff Speck, and I hope you enjoy his presentation.
Thanks, David. Thank you, David. It's been a real pleasure working with Dave Elgin and his team, and I was sad to hear tonight, you guys probably know because you're here, that David's retiring, and that's sad for me, but I'm very grateful that he was around to shepherd the work that I did here. And if it hasn't been done already, at least not tonight, I'd love to hear a round of applause celebrating David's career here at the city. Speech. So, as always, I have a lot to say, and limited amount of time. I know that you all have other things to do with your evening, and I do want to be brief. So, New Englander that I am, I'll talk very fast. I bring you greetings from Boston. When I start, this is my whack-a-mole photo. We can bring the lights down if I don't know who has the controls, but this isn't about me. This is about, with apologies to the film crew, this is really about the images, so I like to have it nice and dark. I trust you won't fall asleep. When I first started, it shows how long I've been working here, that when I first started working here, I was coming from Washington, and now I'm still working here and I'm coming from Boston. But I moved back to my childhood home just this past, or I should say my childhood home city, not the home itself, just this past year. And it's not all sad when you get a lot of snow. But now, I worked in Miami for a decade, and people would always say, I grew up in New England, I'm a skier and all of that, but I worked in Miami for a decade, and people would always say, Miami, what do you know about snow? And now I've got them all beat, because I come from Boston. So, who heard me at the Trees Forever event? Oh, good, only a few of you. So, who has heard me present some of the proposals that we're doing here in Cedar Rapids? Okay, a few more, but not that many. So for most of you, all of this will be relatively new. And for those of you who've heard me before, and even the few of you who are at Trees Forever, what I've been asked to do is to hone down into one aspect of the talks that I like to give. And as you can see, tonight I'm talking about the safe walk. Normally I talk about the walkable city, and I talk about all the things that add up to the walkable city, as I'll explain. But I was asked to hone into this part tonight because it bears much more relationship to a much more direct relationship, the conversation that I'm going to have with you tonight, to the specific changes that are being proposed in the downtown of Cedar Rapids, which, as always happens in cities, garnered initial support, some initial skepticism, and then as time passed, people started to get worried about them. And I think the reason I'm here tonight, for me, if not at least for you, is to recommunicate why these things are so important, to give you the evidence, to give you more confidence in the proposals, and hopefully to make you, I'm looking at all of you individually, to make you people who feel it's worthwhile to come out and support these proposals, because I think they're very important proposals for the future of your city. And what's really fun, I was thinking maybe there'd be more people who had heard me speak before, but what's really fun is that since that talk at Trees Forever, which I think was 3 years ago, there's like a ton more data. There's more data. So I've got more information to support some things that I told you, and I've got some new things to tell you that I've never told you before because I hadn't learned about them. And what's amazing about this work, for someone who was trained as an architect, who's working as a city planner, is that the science of traffic engineering and street design has been so poorly perpetrated as a science for so many years that the data we're just now beginning to really understand how trees work. How streets work. Trees Forever on my brain. We're just now beginning to really have a firmer understanding of what makes for a safe street. Because we had it wrong, we being the various professions associated with making streets, we had it wrong for a long time. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about the safe walk. This is my other cred. My wife's from Iowa, and I spent a lot of time here. So yes, I'm the out-of-town consultant, but I want you to know I do know Iowa fairly well. And I've been working in Davenport, Cedar Rapids, and Des Moines, and Waterloo. And I have family in a number of those places, also in Numa. Has anyone been to Numa? That's a long way from here. So I'm a city planner, which means I do two types of work. I make plans for existing places like South Beach in Miami, where I lived for a decade. And I always show this slide because I want to remember to give credit to Andres Dwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who were my mentors and who were the reason that I went to Miami. They created the new urbanism movement, starting with the design of the town of Seaside back in 1980. I made a pilgrimage to them when I got out of architecture school in 1993 and basically made them hire me because I wanted to learn about this thing that was called the new urbanism, that was about proposing alternatives to suburban sprawl. And so as a city planner, I do plans for existing places like South Point in Miami Beach, trying to make it better, and I do plans for new places. And this is Kentlands. It's one of the landmark new urbanist projects. I worked there even when I was in school, when I was apprenticing with Andres and Liz. And as a new urbanist, that means something quite specific, which is that it's my job to go and measure. When we're going to make a new place, we don't try to invent it. We go to the places that people love the most, and we measure the streets. We pace the curbs. We count the trees. We count the cars, because we really think that rules that will allow us to create the best new places can be derived from the best old places. And that, yes, older places must modify in order to deal with modern realities, but still the most valued and beloved and, value-retaining communities in America happen to be the ones that were built in earlier times, and they hold many great secrets for us. Now, we didn't study South Beach to build Kentlands, of course. We studied Georgetown to build Kentlands, because Kentlands is near Washington, D.C., and the new urbanism is also very much about place. And in architecture school, we were all taught that architecture must be of its time. But as new urbanists, we say that's not so important. Architecture must be of its place. And so where we are is key. So I wrote a book with Andres and Liz called Suburban Nation that got me appointed to run the design discipline at the National Endowment for the Arts, where I oversaw this program where I met my first Iowa mayors. I met Frank County, I met the earlier mayor from Davenport, whose name I'm blanking on. But this is an amazing program, and I bring it up because every 2 months, somewhere in America, we would collect up in a room 8 mayors, 8 designers who I would get to pick. Each mayor would bring their most pressing urban design challenge, and then we would argue around the table. There's Mayor County on the left from Des Moines. We would argue around the table and try and solve, lock ourselves in a room for 2 days and try and solve these mayors' most pressing urban design challenges. Where do I put my convention center? How do I reconnect to my riverfront? And we wouldn't always solve the problems, but it was really teaching mayors about urban design, but it was also teaching us, designers, and the designers in the group, half mayors, half designers, teaching us about what mattered to mayors and mattered to cities. And it was through this experience that I took the discussion that we had called New Urbanism, which, by the way, turned off the conservatives. And before that, we had called it Neo-Traditional Town Planning, which turned off the liberals. And then we were calling it just good urban design or best practices in town planning. But what I learned from the mayors was actually it was all about walkability. That the criteria they were using to determine the success of their cities and whether they were livable and successful places was street life. And so it was through the experience with the mayors that I was able to reframe the argument accidentally into this thing which nobody can be against, which is walkability. And so it's all the same stuff about making great places, but by framing it in terms of can we walk, can we bike, in addition to driving, can we do those things? Because if we can, then we're on the right track in terms of design. So more recently, I've been doing a lot of work with this group you may know called CEOs for Cities, and I bring them up because they're an organization that cities hire to be competitive. Cities say we want to attract talent, we want to attract millennials, we want to attract corporations. How do we do it? And CEOs for Cities understands that it's a two-part deal. That half of it is programming. What sports facilities do we have in our city? What events like Art Prize in Grand Rapids do we hold to make people come to understand the downtown in a new and different way? But the other half is design. Just what is the everyday design of the spaces between the buildings that are going to cause people to want to inhabit our community on foot and not just in cars? And so the design part is what I think has been forgotten for a long time in economic development, in urban revitalization. And learning from our best places is where this practice of mine takes off from and is the kind of information I want to communicate to you tonight. So we begin with this premise that the mayors brought to the meeting that I wouldn't have perhaps said with such confidence 10 years ago, but now I can say with confidence I think most Americans believe that walkable places are thriving places. And if that's the case, the question is how do you get people to walk? And that all adds up to what I call my general theory of walkability, which is meant to evoke a smile. It's not all that serious. But it is a theory in the sense that it's a hypothesis which is continually tested, experimented with, and refined. It's the framework that I used in my book, Walkable City, which I hope this talk compels you to read, no obligation. But it says, how in America do we get people to walk? That's the fundamental question. In America, in which driving is so cheap, right? You don't pay the full cost of driving, and the car sits in the driveway between you and everything, for most people, right? And 4/5 of the cost of owning the car are owning it, and only 1/5 is driving it. So there's all this incentive because every trip you take costs less than the trip before. Once you own that car, there's all this perverse incentives to drive it as much as possible. So if we're going to get people to drive in this country, which actually different from other countries, in which you don't pay the full cost and there's so much incentive to drive, if we're going to get people to walk, the walk has to be as good or better than the drive. And that means it must do 4 things simultaneously. It must be useful, it must be safe, it must be comfortable, and it must be interesting. And tonight, in a fun change up from what I normally do, I get to skip 3 of those and just focus on the safe. because the other categories, which are all important and all must be accomplished, those three categories are largely the function of the private sector. Now, the private sector is often guided and encouraged and perhaps mandated by the public sector to do the right thing. So in terms of the useful walk, category 1, the public sector can either zone uses so they're close to each other, it's easy to walk to shopping or walk to the office, or they can zone them far apart from each other. So government plays a role. Similarly, in terms of the comfortable walk and the interesting walk, which is essentially what kind of buildings are lining the sidewalk, and are they shaping the street properly, and do they have friendly faces and open doors? That's also a function of what we were talking about in a city meeting this afternoon with city staff, which is zoning. And what zoning and subdivision ordinances can control. How will buildings meet the street? Are the doors open? Are there surface parking lots when you're walking down the sidewalk, or are there building faces, right? So every one of these categories, government plays some role. But in the work I'm doing with the Public Works Department, it's really all about what the Public Works Department is in charge of, which is the design of the streets. And the design of the streets is an outcome of the safe walk. Or I should say, is a function of the issues that we're going to discuss under the category of the safe walk. So there's about 100 different moving parts that add up to a walk being safe or not. I'm going to cover about 8 of them, I believe. And they're all important. And there are others, but these are the ones that I think are most at play in your city and particularly in your downtown. The first, and I should say in addition to, let me give a little history. So after I gave my speech here at Trees Forever, I was brought in by the city to do a couple different things with them. One of which was to help them modify their kit of parts for making new streets. So changing the standard lane widths, introducing proper components for adding bicycles, ensuring that there's proper street trees, all that sort of thing, so that both when the city makes a new street and when a developer makes a new street, that we can have a better standard. And so I prepared a document that was kind of subsumed into the city document and influenced how those work. But more directly in terms of as a designer, I submitted a proposal for the redesign of the entire, and you know, this was a scope of work that I recommended. It wasn't that they said, Jeff, we want you to do this. I said, look, the way I can help you the most is by taking this part of your city that has the most potential to be truly walkable and make it what it isn't, which is safe. And that's essentially the heart of the downtown. So I submitted a proposal, for those of you who don't know, I submitted a proposal for essentially restriping, as I'll show you, restriping the 20 block or so urban core of your city. Subsequently, an engineering firm, AECOM, did a revised version of that was completely in keeping with my principles, although it changed a few things. Then the city has changed a few things as it's been moving forward, but the plan now, and it's already implemented, and you can see a street or two as you go downtown, is that as the city improves and repairs streets, as it always does, it will be repairing and improving them to this new standard, which is essentially changing the striping of all of the streets in that downtown grid, which is a project I'll show you and that I show cities all over America and frankly the world, because it's a really, you know, would I love it if you did it all in one day? Sure. But the fact that you're doing it over time as you fix your city anyway makes it much more fiscally prudent, and the design is good, even though it's not exactly the design I gave you. So that's the background. So the first thing that makes a street safe, or I should say makes a city safe, and I'm not talking about crime, because now the great threat to pedestrians in most places isn't crime, it's getting hit by cars. And if you can make a place where people want to walk, you won't have a crime problem because you'll have enough people supervising each other that crime kind of disappears. So the first thing is the size of the blocks. This is Portland, Oregon, famously walkable. You can see down there the scale in the corner. Famously 200-foot blocks in Portland. This is Salt Lake City, famously unwalkable, famously 600-foot blocks. Here they are side by side. It's amazing, right? You can fit 9 Portland blocks in a Salt Lake City block. In Salt Lake City, I don't know if you've been there, there are certain intersections where they give you orange flags to hold aloft as you cross the street so you won't get hit by a car. Because essentially, a 200-foot block city can be principally a 2-lane city. But the same amount of development, or even actually a little bit less development, when you have it on a 600-foot block and the streets are so far away, you have to have kind of a 6-lane city. So the typical street in Salt Lake City then becomes this 5 or 6-lane street, because just to serve that great mass of real estate that it surrounds. Here's a really important study that was done in California, comparing 24 different cities, divided them into safer cities and less safe cities based on the highway deaths. By the way, if anyone back there wants to sit, there are some seats right in front, and I won't spit. Notice as the average block size doubles, the average fatal crashes not on highways almost quadruples. And there's a clear inverse correlation between the size of the block and the safety of the street. So the first thing is you want to have small blocks. You do have small blocks. You don't have Portland-sized blocks, but as America goes, your blocks are pretty darn small. They're about 300 feet. This is where we say you've got good bones. So you can grow in a healthy way. You have the foundation of a walkable downtown, and frankly, most of your older residential neighborhoods as well, because you have this armature of many streets which can be small. Next, of course, as implied by what I just said, is the number of lanes in the street. So how many lanes are there? The more lanes there are, this is Oklahoma City. Mayor Cornett is joining me tomorrow in Des Moines, where we finally try to get them to pull the trigger on their one-way to two-way conversion, which I'll talk to you about in general. But how many lanes there are determine how many lanes you have to cross, of course, but also, let's face it, when you have 4 or 5 or 6 lanes all together, what does it look like? A highway, right? And of course, the more lanes there are, the more opportunity to jockey, and the more drivers tend to speed over the speed limit. So it's kind of obvious, but what that means is to the degree that you have more lanes than you need, you have a street that's more dangerous than it needs to be. And that was the case in Oklahoma City. So the mayor called me. I had met him not too long before at a Mayor's Institute. This is Prevention Magazine, and they were naming the best walking cities in America, and they also named the worst walking cities in America. Specifically, Oklahoma City is the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country, which doesn't feel good if you're Oklahoma City. So he called me in and said, what do we do? And I said, well, let's do a walkability study. And I didn't really know what that meant, but we kind of figured it out together. And now I've done about 13 walkability studies where I say, the goal is to figure out how you as a city, in the least amount of time, spending the least amount of money, can witness the greatest increase in people walking and biking in your city, and particularly in your walkable areas, aka your downtown or downtowns. So we did this study, and the first thing I noticed was this is the traffic counts map. Look at these counts, 5,000, 9,000, 4,000. So they've got nice small blocks. Their blocks are about the size of yours. And we said, holy cow, you've got Portland blocks, but you've got, Salt Lake City streets. So there's a disconnect. So we saw these counts, and we know, and you'll know after tonight, any traffic engineer will tell you that a 2-lane street, without a center turn lane, just a 2-lane street, will handle 10,000 cars per day, which is roughly 1,000 cars at peak hour. This is something we know. So look at these numbers. Well, I had in front of me a copy of the brand new downtown plan, and these are streets that were designated as arterials of 4 lanes or more in that plan to be restriped and rebuilt to 4 to 6 lanes, and these were the car counts on them. We said, wait a minute, you've got a major disconnect here between supply and demand. Your supply of lanes is way in excess of your demand for lanes. So Hudson Avenue, carrying less than 2 lanes worth of traffic was 6 lanes wide. And so something fortunate happened, which is that the Devon Energy Corporation decided to build a 50-story tower in the heart of the downtown that was going to generate $200 million in tax increment, and that was decided like the day that my study came out. And they said, what can we spend the money on? And they decided we're going to spend it on rebuilding the entire downtown core, all the streets from building face to building face, 40 blocks of downtown. And it was my job, basically, because I'd already started to do it in my walkability study, it was my job to redesign all of the curb-to-curbs. And what happens when you turn a principally 4-lane downtown into a principally 2-lane downtown is that you get lots of asphalt for other things. So we actually doubled the amount of on-street parking, which the merchants love. According to the National Trust's Main Street program, 15 years ago, every on-street parking space was worth $10,000 in revenue to a nearby merchant. And that's now considered a low estimate. We also took a city that had no bike network whatsoever and created a pretty robust bike network. So a street like this becomes that. Here it is under construction. A street like this becomes that. See the bike lane. And the downtown is really looking great. Now this is a lot of money to spend. And I point out to all the cities, I show them this and then I show them Cedar Rapids. And I say, you can rebuild, but you can rebuild one street for the price of restriping a whole downtown. And I'm always saying, if there's another way to do it that way. So here's your downtown grid, and you can see that with a few exceptions, it's mostly 4-laners, and it's half one-ways. And we'll get into this a little bit more in a minute. The next issue regarding lanes, it's really important, it can't be forgotten in this conversation, is the left-hand turn lanes. Because left-hand turn lanes can wreck a downtown. This is Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And that whole curb there used to have vibrant shops in it. And now they're all dead and gone, or dead and not gone, because this is a state highway. And the state DOT said that we need a 300-foot long left-hand turn lane to serve this street, which has 7 houses and goes nowhere. Because that's the sort of thing that state highways do. And PennDOT's really good at it. So when a left-hand turn lanes have their place. If you have an intersection that's congested because of people waiting behind cars turning left, then it makes sense to have a left-hand turn lane. But you shouldn't have them where you don't need them. Many cities put them everywhere, no questions asked, every intersection, even though they're not necessary. And they shouldn't be any longer than necessary, because whenever you have a left-hand turn lane, you're losing something. In this case, you're losing a flank of parking, which these businesses absolutely relied on. But here's the model. This is Albuquerque. Albuquerque does a lot of things not so well, but one thing they have is this classic left-hand turn lane. And this is how you do a left-hand turn lane. All you need to do is stop the parking about 50 feet from the corner, and then the left-hand turn lane kicks in, takes up that extra asphalt. Well, that's obvious enough, Jeff. Like, why are you even showing me that? That's just kind of obvious, right? But this is how cities are doing left-hand turn lanes now. Everywhere. You've got them too. They're everywhere. This idea that you have to, like you're on a highway, so we're going to design it for a 50-mile-an-hour speed where you have to swoop right before you go left. See that? And this is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where we literally lose 150 feet of curb parking because you have to have this right sweep before this left turn. And frankly, a left-hand turn lane that's not needed because there's no opposing traffic across the intersection. It's a T intersection. So you need to pick the right model when you do your left-hand turn lanes. This is your model. Next, does anyone recognize this, where this is? This is Davenport, where I first encountered the beast known as the massive Iowa one-way. So one-way streets, we've finally got the data. We finally know technically what the engineers told us was wrong, but what we as citizens knew, which is that one-way streets are more dangerous than two-way streets when they have multiple lanes. Clearly a one-way, one-lane street like you find all over the place in Portland, or the typical cross street in Manhattan, right, is a one-way, one-lane street. That's a safe street. But when you've got a two-way street, as maybe most, I'm going to say most American cities in the 60s through the 80s, mostly in the 70s, converted their two-way grids to one-way. So you've got these nice wide streets like yours and like Davenport's that have 2, 3, 4 lanes, sometimes 5 or 6, like the one we saw in Oklahoma City, and they put in a one-way system to speed travel through the downtown, because the downtowns were desperate. They were trying to compete with suburbia, right? And they knew if they put in those one-way pairs with the green wave, that people could get in and out of downtowns very quickly. And of course it worked. People got out of downtown very quickly. Didn't always come back, right? But the logic is clear that a one-way network with green waves does move more vehicles more quickly. But the question is it the right thing for your downtown? And it's not the right thing in terms of safety. It's not the right thing in terms of the success of merchants. Why is this a more dangerous street than the two-way equivalent? First of all, there's no one moving in the opposite direction, so there's less reason to be cautious as a driver. Secondly, there's this sheer momentum of all these vehicles going the same direction that is more intimidating to a pedestrian. You know the experience, one car slows down to let you cross and the next car sneaks out behind, right? And you don't see it, he doesn't see you, it's very dangerous. But the main reason this street is more dangerous is because the additional lane in the same direction gives you the opportunity to jockey. And as a driver, when you have that extra lane, when you have that second lane in any direction, which is obviously very available here, second and third lane, then your frame of mind as a driver changes from someone who's just sitting happily behind, or maybe not so happily, but sitting behind the car in front of you, and your speed is regulated by the car in front of you. But here there's always an opportunity to go faster. And God knows the other lane is always the faster lane, whatever lane you're in. And so you stop looking around, you stop looking at the shops, you stop looking for pedestrians, you enter that mindset of how can I get through here quickly? At least if you're me, you do. And I think most people do that too. So, but the real story, this story hit the presses before the safety story, was the merchant viability story. And places like Vancouver, Washington, where they tried everything to bring back this downtown. And it was really struggling. They tried the 6 Bs of the 80s, the bricks, the berms, the banners, the bandstands, the bollards, and the balloons. Nothing brought back the downtown. Then in one day, they got permission from I think it was a state road, they got permission, and they made a two-way street. And with the traffic volumes remaining the same, the merchants' revenues doubled. And so it was famously written up in Governing Magazine and kind of became a battle cry for a lot of communities around the US. And now hundreds of communities are changing their systems, whether it's one street or a whole network. I forgot to mention in Oklahoma City, that was a half one-way system. It's becoming an all two-way system. In Savannah, East Broad Street, like many streets, was converted one way in 1969, and they counted, an architect counted just the number of businesses on the tax rolls and found that 64% of the businesses on that street just disappeared pretty quickly off the tax rolls. In 1990, it was reverted to two-way, and 50% of businesses came back right away, almost right away. Brand new study. This study is 6 months old. Louisville, Kentucky, you can see Brooks, First, Second, and Third. Brook and First were reverted back to two-way based on citizen demand. Second and Third were kept as one-way. Brook and First, car crashes went down 48%, crime went down 23%. On the one-ways, Third and Fourth, car crashes went up 15% and crime went up 36%. So we're finally collecting all this data. Citizens understand this. This is New Albany, Indiana, where I'm working. This is a citizen-led effort. I had nothing to do with this. Where they're demanding in their residential neighborhood, which is part of downtown, they're demanding the reversion to two-way streets because they're being overrun by these one-ways. And as you can see, basically all of your east-west streets, all of the avenues are one-way streets except for First, which is a state road. Next is the width of the lanes themselves, right? So we had the size of the blocks, the number of the lanes, presence of center turn lanes, the direction, one way or two. How wide are the lanes? Andres Duani, my old boss, used to joke that the typical street, the typical subdivision in America allows you to witness the curvature of the earth because it's so wide. And what's happened is the standards have changed. This is the old 1960s standard, and this is the 1980s standard. Airplane the same height, Washington, D.C. region. Look at the width of those streets, and look what happened in 20 years. And there's lots of reasons for this. Chief among them, fire department, minimum clearances. which do reduce responder time while increasing the number of deaths and injuries that happen in the high-speed streets. It's a long discussion that sometimes you need to have with the fire chief. Say, are you interested in response time, or are you interested in life safety? Because if you want to save lives, you will have safer streets that maybe your trucks have to go a little more slowly on. But this is my old neighborhood in South Beach in Miami, and just because the standard changed, it was a perfectly good street before, but they had to repave it because they had to redo the curbs because it wasn't draining properly. And when they redid the curbs, this new standard kicks in, and we lost half our sidewalk and our street trees because of the new standard. What happens in wider lanes? A traffic engineer will tell you each lane width corresponds to an implied design speed. So everyone knows an 8-foot lane is a slow lane. A car comes at you, you're going 10 miles an hour, 15 miles an hour. A 10-foot lane is a standard urban lane, 30 miles an hour, no problem. A 12-foot lane, you'll find that on a 70-mile-an-hour highway. Right, a 13-foot lane, 70-mile-an-hour highway. So lane width corresponds to speed, and speed corresponds to death. If you're hit by a car going 35, you are 8 times as likely to die as being hit by a car going 25. That's a really important number. So you add 10 miles an hour in that key area where the speeds at which people are driving in cities, 25 to 35, you add 10 miles an hour and you're 8 times as likely to die or your child to die. Increased lane widths are supposedly, according to one study, responsible for about 900 additional traffic fatalities per year. And we've been saying this, we laymen have been saying this for years and years, and the traffic engineers have only slowly begun to take notice. So that many engineers, none in this room I believe, but many engineers still are fighting for 12-foot lanes versus 10-foot lanes because they were taught that 12 feet is safer. Why? Why were they taught this? Because they were raised on highways. And I say that not as a joke or a snide comment. The fact is that the traffic engineering manual is a highway engineering manual that's only slowly been modified to work for city streets. But the history of the traffic engineering profession in the US is a highway engineering profession. And it is true, on a highway, all the things you do on a highway to make it safer do make it safer. Widening lanes, safer. Eliminating trees, safer. No parallel parking, safer. Broader sight angles and more swoopy corners, they all make it safer. Why? Because on a highway, you look at the speed limit, you set the cruise control for 9 miles an hour over the speed limit, and you go. Right? If you're me. But that's not how people drive in cities. In cities, your speed is not determined by the speed limit. Your speed is determined by all the little visual cues that are in that street. How many, sorry?
Side friction.
Side friction, right. How many lanes are there? How close is that vehicle next to me? How close is the curb? Are there trees that I might hit? Are there cars coming at me? Is there parallel parking that a car might pull out of? Or maybe I'll find a parking space. Right? All these little cues that tell the driver how fast to go. It is environment influencing behavior, which is fundamentally what was missing from the highway engineering education. So we've moved on, but residents, of course, have understood this for many years. In Birmingham, Michigan, they fight for narrower streets. Portland, always ahead of the curve, has its own Skinny Streets program. And now this is for residential streets. This is the sort of thing you find in your best neighborhoods, if I can call them that. Your most difficult to purchase homes in neighborhoods, out by the country club. I forget what it's called. But you've got, bad timing. I think I need to attack the computer. Hold on for a second. There we go. If you can see that, if you're close enough, those are 20-foot and 26-foot streets, two-way streets with parking on one side or both, which basically implies about a 12-foot lane that handles traffic in two directions. This is exactly the street that many of us grew up on, that we all want our kids to grow up on, that they're comfortable playing street hockey in, right? But it's not allowed. But wherever we go to make a new community, like this one that we built for Vince Graham outside of Charleston, this is called Ion. We have to break the law and get permission, and we do these skinny, two-way lanes, which isn't what you want in the heart of your downtown, but it's perfect for a low-density residential neighborhood. And Vince Graham is a great speaker, he goes around to conferences and he shows these narrow rights of way, and he quotes this famous philosopher who said, "Broad is the road that leads to destruction, narrow is the road that leads to life." And this plays very well in the South, as you might imagine. So the profession is catching up. This is maybe 5 to 7 years ago. The Institute of Transportation Engineers, the official body of transportation engineers, came out with this standard, which has more recently been adopted by the Federal Highway Administration, that said 10 feet. But they said, oh, how about 10 to 11? He goes, what about buses? They hadn't really figured it. They hadn't really thought about it fully yet. But more recently, we're focusing on this 10-foot standard. And city after city has realized that 10 feet is enough. Because how often does a bus pass a bus pass a bus at speed? And a bus is 10 feet wide mirror to mirror, 8.5 feet wide body, 10 feet wide mirror to mirror. When a bus passes a bus and there's 2 buses parked in the 2 parking lanes, they have to slow down and jockey a little bit. That's precisely the sort of thing that makes the city safe, right? This is bootleg. Someone shot this for me at a recent conference. The engineer who was writing the 7th edition of the ITE Traffic Engineering Handbook. 10 feet should be the default width for general purpose lanes at speeds of 45 miles an hour or less. So this says a couple things. First of all, it says that 10 feet is now the standard. No reason to go wider. But also, yeah, you should go wider if you want people to go more than 45. So now we can say, without any doubt, yes, we can have an 11-foot lane. How's 50 miles an hour strike you when you're downtown? Right? So it's very important to see this. So I'm speaking in Des Moines tomorrow, and my report that was issued 18 months ago was shared in a public meeting last week. So now there's all this kerfluffle about my recommendations, and one councilman, I hate to pick on councilmen, but sometimes it's good to have an enemy, you know? But one councilman says, I don't think we could survive with 10-foot lanes if the buses are 10 feet wide. And I'm saying, yes, there will be a zombie apocalypse in Des Moines. But I just love the choice of words, you know, survive. But the great irony, of course, is this is all about saving lives. And it's the slower lanes, the narrower lanes, that will allow people to survive. And here's a final kind of example. I hate driving out of Washington, D.C. on Connecticut Avenue. It's a 6-laner. It handles probably 30,000 cars a day. And I hate driving on it because you always feel like you're going to hit the car next to you, because it's got 8.5-foot wide lanes. But this is a 30,000 car per day street, tremendously busy street, which everyone hates. But its record of death and destruction, given how many cars it handles, is remarkably light, because it's encouraging slow driving. Jeff, nice to see you. I didn't see you.
Good to see you, Jeff.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for being here.
And then finally, I just did a walkability study in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where a lot of the streets are state highways. And I found this street, which is also a state highway, 9-foot lanes. And just to prove to them that no one was dying, this is a 9-foot lane street that's a state highway in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So I've now added video so people can see that these things actually work. And what we know in everyday life, which people want to ignore, is that actually 9-foot works, 8.5 can work. So we're very comfortable with 10 feet as the new standard. And I'm hoping that Des Moines will be. I know that you are, or are now as of this moment. Bicycling, I like to say that urban bicycling is the largest revolution currently underway in only some American cities. This is Portland, Oregon, which is famously, in Portland, they bike 15 times as much as the rest of the country. What people don't know is back in the 70s, they biked about the same as the rest of the country. But they invested heavily in bicycle infrastructure. $60 million. Now, it was over 30 years. It was only about $2 million a year, and it was half what they paid for one cloverleaf repair. But they invested $60 million in bikes, and they went from biking just the same as everyone else to biking 15 times as much. And I asked my friend Tom Brennan, who works for Nelson Nygaard, the engineering firm, to send me some pictures of the Portland bike commute, And he sent me these, and I said, well, is that bike to work day? He said, no, it's Tuesday in Portland. New statistic, when I was a kid, 15% of Americans, students walked or biked to school. Now 13% of American students walk or bike to school. 10 years ago in Portland, 13% of the kids walked or biked to school. Now 43% of the kids walk or bike to school in Portland. Amazing accomplishment. Combination of bike lanes, pedestrian facilities, and small local schools. All very important there. This is the gold standard of bike lane. This is called the buffered lane. And what happens here, this is a buffer, but it really works as a buffer best if there's also the parallel parking there. So you take the parallel parking that was on the curb, this is Chicago, it's one of Rahm Emanuel's new bike lanes. You pull the parallel parking one lane off the curb, so you lose a lane. You get a door buffer, and then two-way bike travel. This is a two-way lane. This guy's breaking the rules. He's probably an Emanuel. But it's an amazing facility. These are the sort of facilities that mint cyclists, that create cyclists, that cause people to go down to their basement, pull out the bicycle, or buy one. And the statistics will tell you, actually, this is what gets the women and children bicycling, not just what we call the mammals, middle-aged men in Lycra bicyclists, right? And the statistics are fantastic. This is Prospect Park West in Brooklyn. And you can see they went from 3 lanes to 2 lanes, added this buffered bike facility. Of course, the number of cyclists tripled. Speeding went from 75% of all cars to 17% of all cars. Injury crashes to all users, pedestrians, bicyclists, but mostly drivers, went down by 63%. And most interesting, the street handles as many cars as quickly as it always did. Not sure why, because it was a congested street, but somehow these 2 lanes are handling as many trips as the 3 lanes did before. So, cities ask me, should we do bold green stripes? This is Long Beach, California, a very automotive city. It's got a lot of bikers now because of this bold infrastructure. And I always say, you don't need to do the bright green stripes. You also don't need to advertise your city. You don't need to tell people that you're a young city, a healthy city, a progressive city, a city that welcomes, talent and young people. But I think it's a good idea. Maybe you don't stripe the whole lane. You stripe it near each intersection so it calls attention to it. But it's like a horizontal billboard that advertises your city as a place of the future, right? But if instead, like Pasadena, you believe that every lane is a bike lane, then actually no lane is a bike lane. And actually, this is the only cyclist I met in Pasadena. Because you don't share roads, the stamped bike symbol in the road, or the share the road sign next to the road, which is what they have in Des Moines. That does not create cycling population. It makes the hardcore cyclists more comfortable, and maybe it makes the cars a little more aware, but it doesn't create more cyclists. And creating more cyclists is the key to bicycle safety, because it's a strength in numbers thing. The key thing that makes bicyclists safe is drivers anticipating seeing them. And the key factor there is having lots of them. So the more bikers you get, the fewer collisions per bicyclist you get. And actually in most cities, as the number of bikers increases geometrically, the number of collisions stays flat. It's not a cult. This is the blessing of the bikes in some church in New York City. This is how I know we'd turned the corner in Washington, D.C. So that buffered bike lane in Washington, D.C. And now there's a maid service that rides these electric bikes from house to house in these buffered bike lanes. This is useful for you. On the left, well, in gray is summer temperature, and green is winter temperature. And jumping all around in no relationship whatsoever to temperature is bicycle population, right? So you see places like Minnesota with a lot more than Iowa. It's principally a function of infrastructure, bicycle infrastructure. Climate matters. You're much better being cold than being hot. It's much easier to gear up and stay warm than it is to stop sweating in Atlanta when you're bicycling. And I saw a cyclist who came in. I was afraid that the hardcore cyclists wouldn't come tonight because they would insist on bicycling and then it was raining and some of them wouldn't come in the rain. Have you guys heard of Walk Score? Walk Score is this website that allows you to rate the walkability of any address in America and soon the world. And I advise you to go home, type in your Walk Score, type in your neighborhood, go to Walk Score, type in your address, and see what Walk Score you get. But I had lunch with Jamie Lerner, who's one of the creators of Walk Score, and it was the rainiest day in Seattle in 50 years. I'm not joking. It was the actual rainiest day in 50 years. And he showed up for lunch on a bike. He said, "My mom told me there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad gear." And I remembered that. A lot of companies, particularly young companies, know that their creative workforce wants to bike to work. This is Denver. Next, parallel parking, often forgotten, a barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. No one wants to walk on a sidewalk that isn't protected for at least most of its length by parallel parking. No one wants to sidewalk dine if there's not parallel parking. This is Fort Lauderdale. Left side of the street, you can see you're allowed to park. The right side, you're not. This is happy hour on the left. This is happy hour on the right. No one wants to sit within 5 feet of a car moving at 60 feet per second. Signals. There's not too much to say about push buttons, except that very few walkable cities have push buttons. The ideal signalization regime is one in which basically when the car gets the green, you get the green. Or ideally, there's this thing called the LPI, the lead pedestrian indicator, and we have them in Washington, D.C. now, and there's some in Boston and other cities. The pedestrian actually gets the green 3 seconds before the cars, so that the pedestrian can claim the crosswalk before the cars start trying to turn into the crosswalk. But this idea that the pedestrians have every push button system is different. Many you don't get the green to cross unless you push the button, which is ridiculous. Most of them you push the button and it has absolutely no influence on when you get the light. Honestly, it has no influence on when you get the light. It might cause the light to last a little longer. In Florida, you push the button, what it means is the light lasts a little bit longer, but you don't get any sooner. So of course you push the button and you wait and you wait and you wait, nothing happens, that's when you jaywalk because you're frustrated. But the proper technique is basically cars and peds and cars and peds. And you have to train your drivers, and they do learn that the pedestrians are claiming those crosswalks first. But most systems that have push button regimes, they do it for the safety of the pedestrian, but it's actually the inconvenience of the pedestrian in the name of safety, and it just discourages walking. I like to give the example, I once walked from Central Park in New York to Penn Station, probably a 2-mile walk. I did that without stopping once, through the rush hour traffic of Manhattan. Because why? If you can't cross this way at an intersection, you can cross this way. There's always a way to cross, and then of course there's those mid-block jaywalking opportunities also. But there's always a way to go, and if there's not always a way to go, and you have to stand there in the cold or the hot, then you're discouraging pedestrians. Then there's the question of how many signals do you have? This is art, this is not an intersection. You know, when I was working in Davenport, Iowa has signals like every intersection in the downtown, even if there's like no cars ever visiting them. It's like a signal, 3 signals for every intersection. And Darren Nordahl, who was the city planner there, did the research. He found out that the same company that was consulting with the city on how many signals to have would then sell the city their signals. So you want to make sure that's not happening here. But the data here is also very clear. In Philadelphia, now this is the difference between a signal and a 4-way stop. 2-way stops can be tricky because if it's a really busy street as a pedestrian, you might not be able to get across it. But if you have a condition where the east-west and the north-south loads are fairly even, a 4-way stop is very safe because everyone's stopping. Think about your behavior in a 4-way stop, right? You know you're going to stop, so you never get going very fast. There's always eye contact around the intersection. You look at the pedestrians, you look at the cyclists. Cyclists just blow through, of course, you know, but it's a much safer condition. And we know this from a study in Philadelphia. where 472 signals were removed because they changed the warranting rules. To give you a warrant to have a signal, which costs money, right? They reverted the rules, and they had to remove 472 signals, which no longer qualified. Data was collected on 199. When a signal was replaced with a four-way stop sign, crashes went down 24%. Severe injury crashes, right, which are a function of speed, went down 63%. And severe pedestrian injury crashes went down 68%. So the data is all very clear. This is funny. Traffic engineers in Philadelphia believe that the safety benefit stems from the elimination of the local habit of speeding up to beat the red. It's a Philadelphia thing, and everywhere else. So that's it. That's the safe walk. There are other things I could have talked about, but those are the main things which I think play a role here in Cedar Rapids. And now, so here's your downtown grid. And when I first got involved, there was a proposal from the merchants along this street, it's 3rd, right? To rebuild 3rd Street very expensively and frankly in a way that would have removed almost all its parallel parking because they didn't know about the value of parallel parking. So for $3 million, they were going to rebuild 3rd Street. And I said, well, can you just take that money instead and restripe the whole downtown? Don't rebuild, but restripe. Restripe. Because you can restripe for so much less money than rebuild. And of course, the city's response wasn't, well, we're going to spend the $3 million right away, but it was, we'll plan the restriping and we'll do it prudently over time, which is fine. But this is your typical street, the 4-lane one-way. And you too have the blocks of a Portland and the streets of a Salt Lake City, almost. The traffic on these streets, I don't think I saw one that was over 7,000 cars per day. Remember, 10,000 cars per day is a 2-laner. So a very clear opportunity. And so, and paint is cheap, right? So we go from this to that, right? First Avenue doesn't change, but we go from half one-way and mostly 4-lane to all 2-way, all 2-lane over time. And we go from this existing parking where red is angle and orange is parallel to this. And these are going to change because the plan changed slightly. But what you see is a great increase, don't worry about the details, but a great increase in angle parking, which is better for merchants and allows you greater density on those blocks. And a bike network which goes roughly from this to this, which is still being refined. But the bottom line is you're going to end up with a lot more parking and considerably more biking because we got to use up that space. This is the current plan, very hard to read, but you can see that there's interventions in every one of those streets, and you can find this drawing upstairs, and they're already implementing it, as you know, and they're not in a great hurry. The great impediments probably are the train tracks and what that means in terms of cost and getting the signals to go both ways across the tracks, very expensive, rather than just one way. But that is moving forward. So good for you. And thank you for having faith in these issues, which I think it's no longer a leap of faith. But when we started, maybe it was. And it's wonderful to see you all moving forward with this. Please read the book. If you're a real junkie and want to learn more about the things I've talked about, so much of it is in the book. All the arguments, most of the data. Some of the data I talked about was new, but most of the data, if you want to arm yourself with these arguments, it's in the book. And then these 2 books have a lot more great information in them. I teach a course every summer at Harvard for anybody. This year I'm teaching it June 25th to 26th, which is basically 2 full days of this. And it's not cheap because it's Harvard, but you get a Harvard diploma for 2 days. So it's a really good deal. And that's my Twitter handle. If you want to communicate with me, that is the best way. Jeff Speck, AICP. But I thank you so much for your kind attention, and I'm happy taking questions if there's an interest. So thank you. Can we bring the lights? Are the lights in back, or are they up here? Okay. Yes.
Yes, Jeff, my name's Rich Patterson, and I liked everything I saw here, but I think there's more to it. I grew up in Denville, New Jersey, and spent much of my life in Moscow, Idaho. Both of those towns have a culture of pedestrian right-of-way. You stand on the curb, cars stop. Here, I feel like we have a culture of pedestrians as targets. Mm-hmm. And no matter what you do with infrastructure, we need to alter the culture of drivers. And I just wonder how you might respond to that.
I don't disagree with you. I was surprised as a kid growing up to go to San Francisco, being a East Coaster, being from Boston, where drivers don't even believe in following the laws of physics, right? And going to San Francisco and seeing what California drivers were like. At least in San Francisco, they were much, much more courteous. And where I was just working in Lancaster, PA, the drivers actually know that the police aren't enforcing the traffic laws, and that has an impact. I think the answer is that yes, that matters, but fixing it is not something I know anything about. So I can imagine, as you could imagine, a public service campaign or other things we could do to call drivers' attention to the fact that they need to share the road better. But it's not something I have any particular advice on. But I do encourage you, I think it's another barrel that we should be shooting out of, and not just the design barrel. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Lynn Stansberry. I've lived here most of my life. Have you known about when you do the parallel park, instead of the parallel parking, doing the angle? It's great for me because I hate parallel parking and I'm not good at it, so I don't do it. But I've noticed that it's very hard to pull out of the places when you're parking, like where we are now at the library.
Yep.
It's very dangerous.
Yep. So Cedar Rapids is a community in which the rear-in angle parking was experimented with pretty early. So a big move in many American cities is to replace front angle with rear angle. Do our current plans contain rear angle currently? Yeah, so, and I'm not going to criticize you for that. A bunch of rear angle parking was tried your city council approved it in Cedar Rapids. It's a great quote, it's in my book. One city councilor said, "I'm approving this for the entertainment value alone."
Well, let me tell you, it's also dangerous when they do the back end parking, because I've been on Third Avenue when they're trying to pull in, and it's not fun for people.
Well, rear angle is hard. It's easier than parallel once you get used to it, but it's still hard. There is no doubt, just statistically, that rear angle is safer than front angle, because but let me finish.
Okay.
The biggest difference has to do with cyclists. You don't want cyclists up against front angle parking. And in the new street networks, street stripings, we're being very careful. We never put a bike lane behind, or a sharrow. We don't want sharrows, but we never put a bike facility behind the front angle parking, because that's how bikes get hit. And when communities have converted the front angle to the rear angle, they go from, I think it was in Tucson, they went from like 2 accidents a month to no more accidents ever. But people just hate it so much. And what happened in in Cedar Rapids, is that people hated it so much and it got taken away. And the impression here is that if you do it again, people will hate it again. My goal was to keep the front angle away from the bikes, and to acknowledge that having that front angle parking is one more thing that generally slows cars down and creates an environment in which you may have some fender benders, but you're not as likely to have high-speed collisions, because when you're driving down a street like that, you're not encouraged to go fast. Right?
Well, I'm also a bike rider, so I know, to stay away from the parallel parking.
You're on the yellow line in the middle, and that's there.
I'm way away from them.
Yeah.
I know it's dangerous because they can't see.
Yeah. So angle is, as long as you keep it away from the bikes, I think the front angle is part of a larger street design that will encourage proper behaviors, even though there's a way to make it safer. Sir?
Yes, I wonder if streets constructed with pavers rather than concrete or asphalt would be safer.
Streets constructed with pavers are definitely safer. The rumble of the car wheels, like you find on a European street, is another thing that slows drivers down. They're just a lot more expensive. I mean, a lot more expensive. You're not comparing apples to apples anymore. So, given that the city has only so many resources, it's difficult to say build that street out of pavers when we could restripe 10 other streets instead. Another thing I didn't show tonight because it's not particularly relevant, because these are all pretty busy streets. Maybe it might become relevant. A new study that just came out a year ago in England found that when you repave a street, a two-way street, not major roads, but kind of medium-sized to smaller roads, if you remove the center line, that the speed of the vehicles drops 7 miles per hour. That the absence of the center line, which makes you feel safe, like, oh, I stay in my lane. As long as I stay in my lane, nothing can hit me, right? So you take the center line away, and all of a sudden, on the same street, you slow down 7 miles per hour. That's something else to throw. Dave, that can be your last act before you abandon ship. But I would say, don't do it on a major street, but on a smaller street that doesn't have a ton of traffic, having no center line might make sense. Even some of them downtown. Yes?
The 4-lane street going down to 3 lanes, one in each direction in the center turn lane. What do you think is the maximum capacity?
Okay, I didn't show this because it's not at issue in the study area. One thing that was in my recommendation to the city for the kit of parts for building new streets was to never build another 6-laner or 4-laner, because a 3-laner handles as much traffic as a 4-laner, and a 5-laner handles as much traffic as a 6-laner. So I left out this whole segment because it wasn't an issue in the parts of Cedar Rapids that I've been working in, but there's this thing that's called the Classic American Road Diet. The Classic American Road Diet takes a 4-laner down to a 3-laner. Now, the amazing thing about this is that you don't lose capacity. When you turn a 4-laner, which has a slow lane and a passing lane in each direction, into a 3-laner, typically the number of injury accidents drop by about 50%. Because it's dangerous to have the passing lane also be the turning lane, right? And also you go to turn left and one car stops for you and blocks your view of the second car, which hits you, right? But because the fast lane is also the speeding lane, because the fast lane is also the turning lane, it's dangerous. It's also, for the same reason, it's inefficient. You think you're going fast, then you have to stop. So what we found is that when we changed 4-laners to 3-laners, and I have a chart of 16 of them, and it's in my book. I have a chart of 16 of them, and they all went from 15 to 20,000 cars per day in a 4-lane road to 15 to 20,000 cars per day in a 3-lane road. And the amazing thing in the chart isn't all the lives that were saved, but the fact that the car volume before and after were no different. And so if you ask, is the volume low enough to make a 4-laner or a 3-laner? Well, if it's low enough to be a 4-laner, then it's low enough to be a 3-laner. But all of these roads tended to be between 15 and 20,000 cars per day, which is a heck of a lot of cars. So the exception, I would say, is if you have a 4-laner that's in a major commercial area, and I don't think you have one here necessarily, but like in the heart of DC, I lived a few blocks from U Street, which is the old Black Broadway of DC. And it's a 4-laner that you couldn't turn into a 3-laner because everyone is always double parking on it. And that's why it needs to be 4 lanes wide. By the way, the typical one-way street in DC is about 32 feet, park, drive, bike. And what's amazing about having the driving lane and the biking lane there is it's a 10-foot driving lane and a 5-foot biking lane, which means actually you can double park and get a car by in the bike lane. And that's a great thing. Bike lanes are actually really great for when things expand because of snow or just that double parking condition. The bike lanes give you a lot of flexibility in that regard. Sorry, now I'm changing the subject. There was a question here, yeah.
You raise an interesting point there in regards to a bike lane. I know in some cities like DC and New York, they put the bike lane down the middle.
Yeah.
You've seen 3rd Street downtown. What do you think about that as a candidate for, at least in part, putting the bike lane down the middle?
I think when you see the bike lanes down the middle of much bigger streets and boulevards, like Pennsylvania Avenue in DC, I think I'd have to look at the curb to curb again But what 3rd Street has, I would change 3rd Street thusly, because I was involved in the design, but I didn't do it. It has like a 3-foot center or 2-foot center. Well, you know, I think it's all right the way it is. In the summer, they put planters in that 2-foot center, which I really like. What that means is then the bike lanes are just standard width bike lanes, like 5-foot bike lanes. The normal way I would do that is to not have even a center line, probably, and have 4-foot bike lanes with 2-foot buffers against the car door. So effectively a 6-foot bike lane. I like a 6-foot bike lane, just because it gives that extra room for the car door. By the way, if you do a 7-foot bike lane, cars will drive in it. So there is a limit. But 6 feet is really great. And you can do 7 if you stripe 3 feet of it as buffer and 4 feet as bike, but there's always the risk that the paint fades and then it becomes a driving lane again. But what you're finding in the plan for the downtown network is that there's a variety of solutions based on the space that's available and the role that the street plays in the regional bike network. So, and I believe there's a place for integrated lanes, there's a place for buffered lanes, and there's a place for sharrows. I like to have sharrows on streets that are just too wide. Like, let's say you've got a 14-foot lane. Well, you can't really put in a bike lane. I mean, you could, but you don't get away with the 9-foot lane. So if you got a 14-foot lane, you could stamp a sharrow in it just to acknowledge that it's too wide. Right? So I mean, so there's a place for sharrows too, but it can't be your standard bike facility, and it isn't here. And you've already, you know, I always forget. I go to cities and I'm like, here's what I can make better, but do congratulate yourselves on all you've accomplished so far, both in terms of the stuff that I came here with, but even before I got here, there was a lot of forward thinking, and there has been a lot of forward thinking, and I don't know why, something in the water in Cedar Rapids, but you know, you guys were poised to do even better because of all of the concern that's been here for so many years. So good for you. Yes, sir.
We went through a period about 25 or 30 years where new neighborhoods were built without sidewalks.
Mm-hmm.
Is there some way that, and we're putting in sidewalks very slowly, is there some way we can make those better for walking without, until we sidewalks universally?
Well, I don't know the circumstances here. I haven't been in those neighborhoods. Actually, I have. I have been in some of them, yes. I remember one in particular not far from the high school that had no sidewalks. Don't remember the name of the street. But my question is, how wide, and this is, so what I want to leave you with, not that I won't be back and not that I'm not already having a specific influence, but what I want to leave you with, and every city with, generally is this kit of parts, where you understand that your travel lanes should only be 10 feet wide and they could maybe be 9, and your bike lane should ideally be 6 feet wide. And you take any street like that, which has no sidewalk, and you measure curb to curb, and you say, oh, it's 26 feet. Well, then I would very actively stripe in a line 6 feet from one side of the street and mark it as sidewalk. Or maybe as a shared use path. If there aren't a lot of cyclists, then bikers and pedestrians can share it. But one thing I'm doing in Ada, Michigan, where that precise condition occurs, it's a street that's got a 3-foot shoulder on each side, and it's got like an 18-inch shoulder on each side and 12-foot travel lanes. The answer is to stripe in 10-foot travel lanes and have a 5-foot or whatever shoulder on one side, and then make it very clear. Put a pedestrian symbol in it. But the curb is nice, but if there's nowhere else to walk, then you sure as heck would love to have a stripe that separates you from the traffic. And in that condition, I probably wouldn't have a center line. So you'd have one like 20-foot or even smaller.
In the residential neighborhoods, most of them don't have sidewalks.
Yeah, good. But obviously the long-term goal is real sidewalks. One more? Wow, okay, well thank you all very much. It's been really fun.